Good afternoon. I'm Darren Walker, indeed, and welcome. I am an African-American man wearing clear glasses, a blue blazer, a blue check shirt here in my library with books behind me. My pronouns are he and him. I want to welcome you to this special occasion, an occasion to hear from Ursula M. Burns. Her book, Where You Are Is Not Who You Are, is a tour de force. The New York Times has called it one of the best books by a CEO written in recent times. The Wall Street Journal praised the book for its authenticity and the author's willingness to give us an inside perspective on what it is like to be a Black woman at the highest ranks of corporate America. So I'd like to welcome Ursula Burns. Welcome, Ursula.
Thank you, Darren. I am so pleased to be here with my Ford family and invited guests. I am Ursula Burns. I am an African-American female. I am sitting in my office with a blue top on, gold earrings, and a gold chain. Behind me is a whole bunch of other offices that just keep going on and on and on. And I go by Ursula Burns, and I am a she, her.
Thank you. And welcome, Ursula Maxine Burns.
Yes.
So Ursula, you know, I rarely read directly from the books that the authors who appear at Ideas at Ford write, because I don't feel a need. I feel I can often summarize, often draw out from my guests. But in this case, I have to read to give context to where I want to start. So you, as the first African-American woman to lead a Fortune 500 company, Xerox, found yourself in the context of corporate America, being a Black woman engineer, an even greater rarity. And so as you started your climb to the very top of corporate America, you write here about the corporate model in America. And what you say is the corporate model in America is male, white male, and always has been. We all start out with 2 arms and 2 legs and a head. But if you're born white with testicles and a penis, you're probably way ahead of the game. I felt I needed to read that excerpt because it could not be properly summarized. Ursula, can you talk about your view about the
what I was dealing with, right? So, you grow up. I grew up in a segregated neighborhood. Most of my peers were Black or brown, Hispanic, poor people, and went to school in a neighborhood that was, populated by people who were like me. I was fortunate enough to have an unbelievable foundation set by an unbelievable mother, which we'll get into in a little while. And so I was excelling. I was doing okay. I mean, we were poor, but we were all poor. I was doing okay. I was doing okay in school. And as time went on, I started to get further and further away from that core of a neighborhood and realized, oh my goodness, my okay was only okay if you were in the neighborhood that we were in. For everybody else, they looked at us and said, you're poor. You have so much that you don't have. You are so you're without so much. And you are handicapped, fundamentally handicapped, for 2 reasons. One is that you're Black, and the other one is that I was a girl. And that, or female at that, as a girl in the beginning, then came female as I went up and up. And that became very obvious. And it hit me like really in my head when I went to corporate America. What I saw was everybody had a chair, everybody had access to bathrooms, everybody had the same physical surroundings. But the unwritten clubs, the unwritten part of the surroundings, and women were, Black people were excluded from. We didn't even know that they existed. We heard about them, but didn't know that they existed. And what I had to do, and we all have to do as we enter this unknown world, is make some choices about whether we're going to try to, kind of sneak in, get in however we can, stay out. That's the other choice, or literally kind of, straddle the line. And I early decided that I would straddle the line, meaning there were certain things that I would not give up, that I would not conform to, that I would be very proud of. And there were other things that I would literally just push back against and fight against and, kind of speak up against or for, depending on what side of the spectrum you stood on. So as a person who was outside, it became very, very clear that I was outside. And I had to make a set of decisions, and I'm sure all of us do, about how you are going to deal with being outside, because changing the outside to make me more ready to deal with it was not likely to happen in my lifetime. So I had to push towards the change, but I had to figure out how to live in the environment that I was living in.
And so being in this big engineering firm, so not a lot of Black women, you were, though, fortunate because you had mentors. And often people say, African Americans say, people of color say, well, there's no one who looks like me to mentor me, or there's no one who has had my lived experience. But I've actually found that, as you found, there are amazing white men and women, and you certainly were mentored by white men and white women. I mean, you worked for Paul Allaire, the legendary CEO, and then his successor, and Mulcahy, and we're very close to both of them.
Correct. My foundations were, this is so positive, I think, when I get down to it. My foundations were set by a strong mother, by a society that had still, at that time, hope and investment in moving people along. So I went to college on a scholarship. I went, you name it. I had help along the way. Most of the help was from white people, white men and women, just about all of it in the beginning of my life outside of my family, right? White men and women enabled me to go to school. They, paid for me to go to camps, etc. When I went into work, that same dynamic played out. Most of the engineers around me, the people who hired me, most of my peers, all of the people in the beginning who mentored me were white men, very little white women. And as I went up in the corporation, white women started to enter the fray, and a couple of Black men. But the foundations were laid by people who were aware of the fact that I needed support, that I had something to give. If there was a little bit of help, if I got a little bit of help, there was something for me to give, and they actually helped. Some of them helped with money, a lot of them helped with time and advice. So it was almost the perfect America, right? The story of the perfect America, right? You get engaged and people will help you along the way.
So let's talk about Olga, Olga Burns. So Olga Burns is a remarkable story, this Panamanian immigrant who comes to New York and makes a life for herself and her 3 children, first down on Avenue D on the Lower East Side, and then in the Baruch housing projects. Tell us about Olga Burns.
Yeah, I generally cry, so I'm going to try not to do that when I get deep into the story, but my mother was maniacal about her children. She had one set of assets, in her life, from the time she was born until the time she died, the only thing that meant anything to her was her three children, even before she had them. She had not a lot of graces in her life. She was Black in Panama.
And just on that point, you raise in the book, Ursula, something that we don't talk about in the Black community very much. Even the racism in our own community. Olga was dark-skinned and she had a light-skinned sister.
And my mother was in her own town, in her own family, like so many are. My mother was a dark-skinned young girl with nappy hair, and her sister was a lighter-skinned girl with the fairer hair. And my mother was treated like Cinderella. She literally was mistreated in her family, in her mother's house, and fortunately got rescued by her stepsisters in her father's house, and they moved her out. She was being treated so poorly when she was 8 or 9, from her house to her father's house, from her mother's house to her father's house. My mother did not have a great young life when she was growing up. She met my father in Panama. He immigrated to the United States under, quote unquote, I call it the Black GI Bill, where if you go fight for war and risk your life, they may give you option for a green card. And a lot of people in Panama at that time, a lot of men and women actually went to fight. And if you lived, you had a shot at going to the United States to get a green card. She came here. My father was not around for very long. I didn't see him until I was 16 years old. My brother was 18 years old when my father came back into our life for 5 minutes, literally not for long. My mother invested all of her energy, her time, all of her joy, all of her patience, every single physical asset she had in assuring that 3 things happened. 1, Terry; 2, Maxine; 3, Deborah. These three assets were prepared for the world. They were confident to do business in the world, that they were going to be good citizens of the world. How she did this, how you could think about how she had the perspective to give up so much.
She had a lot of grit. She didn't have credentials, but she had grit.
And she had a soul that I think she literally was a blessed woman. When I wrote the book, I say in the book, please, my mother was not a saint. She could curse like a sailor. she had,
as you said in the book, very clearly.
She could curse like a sailor. And we learned all the Spanish curse words. We learned no Spanish straight words, but my mother's first language was Spanish. And we learned all of those. She was very impatient sometimes because she was in some ways short-tempered. But on the flip side of that, she was insightful in ways that are amazing today. The title of this book, Where You Are Is Not Who You Are, she used to say to me all the time, to me, Max, Ursula Maxine Burns, Max, you see this building? You see this building? It's dirty, it's falling down. That's not you. That's not us. We are not dirty, we're not poor, we are not falling down. We are not, this is where we are, Max, but this is not who you are. And then she would end it with, and remember that when you're rich and famous. And the reason why that's so amazing a statement is there's no way my mother had any idea of that I would be anything like I turned out to be. She died when I was 25 years old. She was 49 years old. She literally had no idea about corporate America, this idea that there were corporations and CEOs. She had no idea about the structure of the economies or about wealth. She did understand very, very clearly the structure of people, about their hearts and their souls, and how you can identify someone who actually is leaving behind more than they take away. And that was her second thing to us all the time. Your responsibility in the world, I will judge your success by whether or not you have left behind more than you take away. And I'm rocketing through the world, right? She sets me up. I go to a private girls' school, private parochial girls' school for high school.
With the tough nuns.
With tough nuns. I mean, we would call them abusive nuns in today's vernacular. Back then, it was pretty standard. If you messed up, you got popped around. and sometimes really badly, really abusive punishments, like standing on one leg, it's crazy behavior.
Yes,
My
the things
mother,
you describe are unthinkable today.
today they would be illegal. Today, the schools would be
It's
closed.
corporal punishment, yeah.
Corporal punishment. But you know what's interesting about that, Darren, is that even though it would be today, it was exactly what I needed then. For me, my brother and my sister didn't
for
make
you,
it
but
through.
not for Terry. I
My
mean,
brother and my
what happened
sister
with
did
Terry
not
was
make it
not
through.
right.
Yeah, my brother was kicked out for hitting a nun. My sister was essentially kicked out for bad behavior. She was gay. We knew in the family she was gay. This is back in 65, 66, 67, those years, right? Early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And my mother knew that my sister was gay. And her retort to my sister is that what does that have to do with how you behave? What does that have to do with anything? Fine, you love who you love. This is a woman who died when I was in 1983. How in the world does she know about this kind of perspective of it's more about what's in your soul. You can't judge by who you love. My mother was raised a strict Catholic. And literally, I guarantee you, she was told my sister was going to go to hell 1,000 times by her because of her sexual orientation. My mother actually couldn't hear that. She didn't hear that. She had these three assets. She cared for us. She fed us the best she could, clothed us the best she could. And the fundamental thing, gave us discipline that was unbelievable, respect for other people, and an education that was the best she could possibly afford, plus 50%. I mean, she went into debt for this. She literally took care of us, wrapped her arms around us, and thank God she was there.
Right. And then you decided you weren't going to go to Yale. You weren't going to, because you got this free ride at a great public institution.
Right. It was actually private at the time, but a great, less than stellar institution. Very good.
But it was publicly financed, because that's why you went, because you got a public
absolutely
grant.
Sorry for
It was financed from the state.
It was financed totally from the state, by the state. My brother got the same thing, by the way. It's called the Higher Education Opportunity Program. I remember when I was in high school, saying to my mother, I had figured out that I was reasonably good in math, and college was never a question for my brother, my sister, and I. My mother made it very clear that you had to go to college. I remember always saying to her, how are we going to afford this? I mean, what do you mean go to college? How are we going to pay for this? She said, you take care of what you have to take care of, and I take care of what I have to take care of. Meaning your business is to get in, my business is to figure out a way to finance it. We literally scoured the earth for scholarships, fellowships, whatever the heck it was. And we got accepted, myself and my brother, into this thing called the Higher Education Opportunity Program, funded by New York State, for students, usually Black and brown students, but students in general, who had the academic potential, but not the credentials, right? We had all the seed work, but none of the credentials. Excuse me. And I happened to get in. I got into HIA. Fortunately, they paid your tuition. They gave you money for lunch and car fare or train fare to get to school. And that was the start of the rest of my life, right? So I go to high school, get a great high school education, not advanced, but great. How great? Study hard, learn how to read and write. My mother, literally these nuns, I could write a sentence. I know how to read. I learned how to read for comprehension, and I knew how to work hard, like to study, to learn. That was the foundation that they gave me, very similar to the foundation my mother gave me, which was basic foundations. And then fortunately, I got some help to catapult me from that base to a university education that was amazing. Entered way behind the class. I mean, it was a disaster. I didn't even have a calculator. I remember that. Everybody had calculators, and I still had the slide rule thing. They all had their stuff. And I remember first semester in school, I was really struggling. I mean, I literally didn't know the basics. I didn't know what they knew. I didn't know a lot about chemistry. I didn't know physics. I had taken classes, but they were nowhere near as advanced as they had to be. It took me one semester with the foundation that my mother taught me and these nuns taught me about learning and about grit, about trying and moving forward, that I caught up and literally, graduated from college. The rest is history. Unbelievably well advanced in my class, graduate school in engineering at Columbia University. Really, really good. All at this time on the backs of, on the shoulders of a whole bunch of white people who kept lifting me up, and my mom. And my mom, right? My mom was there, and my family was there, but everybody who I saw at that time helping me, giving me advice, giving me support, were white men, and some women just keep saying, Ursula, keep pushing, keep pushing, keep pushing. And finally, I had a grip, like a hold on the ledge of prosperity, and that ledge I held on to for a long time, and then I got a whole bunch of African-American men and women, white women, who just catapulted me to the next level.
So let's talk about that, because one of those people was Vernon Jordan. You were an up-and-coming engineer, had been identified as someone with high potential, but you were not designated. And certainly no one said, this is the young woman who's going to be a leader of the company. But Vernon was a member of the board of Xerox. And tell us about your first encounter with Vernon Jordan.
Yeah, so I'll tell you about my first encounter with him in 2D world, right? My mother was, we had magazines, we would get them from people throwing them out, and you go, my mother cleaned offices.
Jet and Ebony and Newsweek and
all. Newsweek, yep. Exactly. So you got them, you got it.
Yep.
And those were our magazines. We got them from wherever you got them from. We definitely didn't have a subscription because we couldn't afford a subscription. And on the cover of one of these magazines was this guy, this kind of handsome guy who had been put on the cover for some civil rights accomplishment that he made. He was running the X or the Y or the Z organization. Fine, that happens. Look at him. I read the story. Okay, everything is fine. Years and years later, I'm at Xerox Corporation. I got selected by the chairman and CEO at the time to be his assistant, his executive assistant. That story is in the book, and it's hysterical because I first turned it down, and that wasn't a smart move. Fortunately, I got advised to kind of not turn it down, and I took it. And one of the things that you did is basically you were a gopher. You went for stuff, you took it, the board would come and you made sure that all of them had the pencils and the pens, that the agendas were on the table, whatever you had to do, get them lunch, show them where the men's room were. There's all kinds of things you had to do. And I do that, and then you leave the room. At that point, you leave the room because the boardroom is happening and the board meeting is happening. And one day out of this thing, it was my first or second meeting, I left the meeting appropriately, the meeting ended, and I was walking down the hall, and behind me, I was in front of him. Behind me, there was this voice, Miss Burns. And I turned around and I heard him say Miss Burns, but I figured there must have been another Miss Burns in the hallway. So I just kept walking, and he said, Miss Burns. And I turned around and he went like this, come here, the finger gesture to come here. And I went to him, and as I was walking towards him, he said, why didn't you answer me the first time? We still have a distance in the hall. I said, I didn't know that you were speaking to me. And he said, well, why would you not think I would speak to you? I said, well, you're Vernon Jordan. He said, and you're Ursula Burns. And that started a relationship that was amazing. So I literally am standing here with Vernon Jordan, and he looked just like he looked, the whole look, tall, gorgeous Black man, unbelievably dressed, stood impeccably, just amazing. And he asked me a whole bunch of questions. Are you married? Do you have any children? I didn't have any children at that point, and I was not married, but I was engaged. If there's a thing called engagement between myself and my husband, which, as you know, Lloyd, there was no engagement. We just kind of married at some point, but we were dating. And he said, I know that you're an engineer. I said, really? He said, I said, how do you know? He said, well, we spoke about you in the board meeting. And literally, we talked for a couple of more minutes, and he said, I want you to come to Washington to visit me. And he said, I would like for you, I'm going to send you a letter. Can you give me your address? This is before email, so this was a written, and I'm going to give you some homework. So the next time you see me, we could talk about the homework. And I figure, this guy, I just had an encounter from like Mars, right? This alien is never going to come back to Earth and see me again. And next time I see him, he's going to forget what he told me, right? Literally, let's say a week later, I get a note typed, signed by him, that said, nice meeting you in the hall. here's your homework. And it was to read a couple of books, Long Walk to Freedom and The Song of Solomon. Why he picked those books, I don't know. And I saw him, a month later, 2 months later, and he said, let's talk about, we did the whole process again. I set up the room and so on and so on. And he's getting ready to leave. He said, we got to talk about my homework that I gave you. And that started this continuous cycle of conversations about, what are you thinking about? What do you want to do? Here's what I'm thinking about, which was amazing to me. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's what I'm thinking about doing. So it was a back and forth that was, I said this at his memorial service. I didn't understand why he was doing it. I couldn't understand. I knew what he was doing, but I still couldn't quite get, why is he doing this? Why does he care? And
you learned that, and you learned that on the journey with him, because years later, he was one of the people who helped make it possible, along with his good friends, Paul and Ann, that you would be in line to be the first Black woman to head a major Fortune 500 company.
He didn't know that I would be that, but he knew I would be something. And his thing was, here's the deal. This is like in hindsight, right? This is looking, I am going to, first of all, he would always say to me, you're not only smart, Ursula, you're beautiful. And this was like, exactly, here I am, this engineer running around and, I'm not the business type. If you get, he would say, not only smart, Ursula, you're beautiful. And then flip it around sometimes and say, not only beautiful, Ursula, you're smart. So it was this whole reinforcement when I needed it. He was preparing me for the possibility that I would be at the spot where I would be in the choice pool, in the selection pool to be CEO. He didn't know, the likelihood was very small, let's imagine. So, but he's putting all this energy into me, this attention into me, because I had the potential to do it. And I'm just amazing. He was my mother. I think about this a lot. My mother just kind of said, it's all about you. It's all about you. It's all about you. Vernon said, it's all about you. It's all about you. It's all about you. I said this to you a lot, Darren, is that I thought I was like this special selected person, right? Of course, my God, he has like this unbelievable relationship with me. Obviously, I was selected and special, but this man had the ability to do this to numbers of people at the same time. He would call out of nowhere. He'd know your birthday. And you can get all of these things that remind of the birthday, but he would actually call and say, hey, how you doing? What's going on? All the appropriate questions. How's your man? He would always say, how's your man? That's my husband. How's your man doing? So on, so on, so on, so on. How's the kids? By this time I had kids. How's work going? He literally engaged at exactly the right time. I'm spending a lot of time praising him, but I praise him like I praise my mom, and like I am trying to be, not anywhere near as good as either of them were, in supporting people in what I call with their whole heart, right? With their whole heart. Nothing, no strings attached, nothing I need except for your effort.
But he encouraged us. As you said, as you and I have talked about, he did that with me. He did that with Ken Chanel. We did that with Bill Lewis. He did that with so many people you and I know.
And white people. He did it with Ann as well.
Oh
Ann
my gosh,
my predecessor.
absolutely.
Literally, he was the person he was on the board when we had a bad time. And he said to the board, don't go out and search for another CEO, because we had just searched and it didn't work out well. He said, you got the candidate inside. And it was Ann Mulcahy. He said, that's the person.
And a big promoter of women. So how did it feel when you got the call to say the board has made you CEO?
So obvious, good. I can't even, good is the understatement of the century, right? So the good news is I was inside the company. So, and I was president before, so I kind of knew that there was a chance that this would happen, more than a chance. I also knew that there was a chance it couldn't, but
Right, exactly. It's never guaranteed.
Never guaranteed. And actually many people, I would say the vast majority of people at that point failed out instead of failing in. But when I got the call, it was amazing. I literally, Anne told me before the vote, and Vernon called me right after the vote. And he was the first guy, I'm outside the room and he called me, comes out and gets me, and he says, congratulations. And he hugged me and kissed me and all that stuff. It's great. And then I went home and I told my family, and it was going to be publicly announced the next day. What you do is you do it and you publicly announce it the next day. And I remember saying to my family, at the advice of Anne and Vernon, that you have to have a talk with them about, your life is going to change, things are going to change, a lot more publicity, all this stuff like that. They didn't pay a lot of attention to it. My husband, Lloyd, obviously was not overly impressed with these kinds of things. He definitely was proud of me, but him, Darren, didn't think that highly of this in and of itself, right? It was not the biggest thing in the world. But the next day was the shocker. I knew that that there would be press. I knew that there would be excitement, but I was little caught off guard by the press and the excitement. I knew that people would say, oh, this is really cool. And, but it became this storm for about 2 days of, look at this Black person look at this Black woman who became CEO. Look at this Black woman who succeeded another woman. It became almost like, I interpret it as like a circus freak show. Look at this freak who made it.
But it wasn't they were freak. I think people were absolutely inspired. I mean, the media was, because your story was such a powerful story. I don't think it was but complimentary to you and your accomplishment.
They were unbelievably complimentary to me and my accomplishments. And this is where, you get rough edges sometimes that are not necessarily useful, right? I actually was surprised that they were surprised by the shade of my skin, the color of my skin, versus the fact that I had run every friggin' function in the company. That, literally, this was not about, a Martian that came in. It should have been a story that said, yeah, the president of the company became the CEO. Right? That's pretty logical. She ran every function, but it was more about, my God, look at this. Can you imagine this kind of ordinary?
Well, but don't you think that's also because we live in the United States in a context, and so things there is a need in the American narrative to, when these seminal moments occur, whoever you are, for there to be a focus on what is different. And so that is part of what it is. And in some ways, it's a way in which through the media, we get to affirm the goodness of America, affirm the potential. Look at this young woman who started in a housing project and now is in the CEO's chair. That's a great story, much more interesting story than look at this guy who started in Greenwich and is now in the CEO. I mean, that's actually not an interesting story.
Agree. And like I said, I understand that my edge at that point was not generous. It was not being generous. My edge
well, speaking, you spoke of, and I would be remiss because you spoke of talking to your family and your husband, who certainly was unimpressed with things that others were often impressed with. And I love the way you describe in the book that Lloyd was your everything. And knowing Lloyd as I did, I know you were his everything. Lloyd, we shared many occasions, trips to Cuba and Washington, and David and I and you and Lloyd. And there is no doubt that he was a formidable force in your life. But Lloyd was older. He really, when you assumed the leadership of the company, you met at Xerox, but he had retired.
Right.
But he was yet very supportive of your career.
And the reason why he retired at the time, he had been in the company for 42 years, but he could have gone for easily, because he was a researcher, many more years. I mean, literally, and that was the original plan. He'd just keep going because it was interesting work for him. He liked it, etc. But we made the decision that, and he was the one who came forward with it, was that he should probably retire because we didn't want to, as he said it, we didn't want to outsource the raising of our children, right? And we had been able to juggle it when they were really young, right? He's a researcher, so he would come home. But when they got like in early teens, or preteen, it was impossible. I mean, they were doing all kinds of things, and I couldn't get there. He couldn't get there because so and so on. He said, why don't I just retire? I remember saying, what? Why don't I just retire? And I can, do some things I'm interested in, and you can continue to do what you're doing. And of course, without him, in the book, I talk about this a lot, and that it was, a lot of things are given to me. I'll say, oh, you're so great, you're so amazing, you're so insightful. And I think about, I want to turn the story a little bit to people who were great, insightful, who gave me opportunities. It was not as much about me. I get it. I'm smart, I work hard, and I'm really, really gritty, and I can solve complex problems. But without Vernon, and without my mother, and without Lloyd, and without people like you, Darren, and people like Ken earlier, my life would be fundamentally different. I literally lucked into a world where I ran into people who had unbelievable hearts, right? Unbelievable hearts. And they didn't all have huge amount of money. They cared about other human beings. And thank goodness I was in that orbit. Right? There's so many who aren't.
And that thank goodness, because Lloyd was your rock. And that's what happens. I mean, I remember because Lloyd's memorial, I was so blessed to be able to be there and honored that you asked me to speak. And I remember when I got back to New York and David came home, and the next morning, David wasn't feeling well, and 3 hours later, he died. And I had just come home at 6 o'clock, and the phone rang, and I wasn't answering the phone because I couldn't, but I saw it was you, and you called to thank me for being in Rochester with you and Lloyd, and I had to tell you the news that David had just died, which was for both of us, I think, a really harrowing, difficult day. And
but just remember, it will bind us together forever, Darren. We will never be separated because of that, ever.
I know. Your Lloyd loved you, Ursula. You were his pride and joy. And I know that my David loved me. And so we were very lucky to have had both of them.
And to have had the time for both of them to meet each other. Because that was also,
because they were both very quirky people, by the way.
They were both very different individuals. And I remember Cuba, going to the farm in Cuba, and your husband and my husband, and it's like, oh my God, what are these people what could they possibly be talking about? Because I would always worry about my husband because he, as you know, he was a little quirky. But David was just totally chill.
Oh my gosh, David totally took to Lloyd. As you remember the whole rest of that trip, they were
buddies.
The Bobbsey twins.
Buddies. Yeah.
I know that that Katie wants us to get to questions. Katie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for submitting questions. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A chat function. So first question to Ursula. What books might you recommend to someone like your earlier self? Would they be the books that Vernon Jordan recommended, or are there others?
I would definitely recommend those two. Long Walk to Freedom is a phenomenal book about courage and tenacity, but also about love and trust in goodness. It's amazing. Song of Solomon is just a beautiful story about oppression in a system and in a society, but done from a very spiritual and and kind of a rhythmic language way. The book that I've read recently that I love is it The Light of Other Suns, S-U-N-S, and the follow-on book, Cast, which are both very good books. The first one I listened to and then read. And if you can listen to it, it literally is like watching a movie. If you listen to it, if you read it the same way, it's just very descriptive book about the Great Migration through the lives of 6 or 7 families or individuals. It's just an amazing, amazing book. Another book that I love and reread often is one by a white woman named Jill Patton Walsh, and it's called Knowledge of Angels. And it's a fiction. It's totally fiction, obviously, because I guess the knowledge of angels would have to be described fictionally, or people would think you're crazy. But Knowledge of Angels, and it's about whether the fundamental premise is: are people born with goodness in their heart, or do they learn it? And it's just done in such a very amazing way, and it begs the question in such a graceful way. I loved the book well before the play Hamilton and John Adams. I like biographies a lot. I loved Malcolm X when I reread it just recently. So I read a lot of different books, and very few of them, by the way, are business books. I think I've read one business book that I liked, and that was Good to Great. Every other book that I read on business, I don't like. That's one of the reasons why when we started to talk about doing a book, it was going to be a business book. And I said, well, I wouldn't even read the damn book if it was published. So why would I write something like that? So we came up with a memoir instead.
Fantastic. So for our next question, many of us experience the pressure of being the first and only. How did you deal with this? It's really exhausting that at this hour in our nation, many of us are still the first and only. Any guidance would be helpful.
Yeah, so I would say exhaustion, save it for a couple of times a year. Don't do it every day. You just can't get too wrapped up in it. I dealt with it. It was a different time for me, so the context is probably a little different for the younger generation today. It was a huge advantage for me, huge advantage. I learned early at Xerox that this was a pretty good environment. I mean, they thought about diversity well before companies thought about diversity. They were a very socially aware company. And I realized, so they weren't out to get me. I didn't have this feeling that they were out to get me, to find a way to have me fail. That's a good foundation, right? Because if you're in an environment like that, then what I'm about to tell you, that probably doesn't work. So I was the only. And I said, wow, people noticed me when I walked in the room. I would literally, if I raised my hand in these, what we used to call quality of work-life councils, these are like all hands communications. If I raised my hand, there were probably 5 other Black people in the room. I was the only Black woman. And if I raised my hand, I knew I would be called on. So I early on figured out that, wow, this may not be the worst thing in the world to be noticed. And since I was in an engineering environment, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it, is pretty black and white. 1 + 1 = 2, even if you're Donald Trump. He may not want to do that. So as an engineer who kind of sought their way through things, I always thought I could figure out the right answer. So I was not shy at all about saying nothing. They would say, what should we do? And I would go, we should do that. I'd raise my hand and say, we should do that. As my mother would tell me, half the time I was wrong, but she would always say to me, you're always still strong in your convictions. So she would say, you got to watch being wrong and strong. In my time, I used it as an advantage. I was the only one. People paid attention to me.
But you weren't emotionally drained. I mean, one of the things young people and people today, as you know, you speak to African-American, people of color, women, about just the exhaustion of performing every day. And as you said, you got to raise your hand every day or you won't be noticed.
And exactly, you literally blend in. And I would always, to me, that was more troubling. And I'll get to a side story real quickly. There were lots of times, particularly as I got more senior in the organization, that I was just like, I was done with it. Are we still having that conversation? Are we having that conversation again? You're surprised that I'm here? I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, I've already proven to you 500 times that I can do this type of work and some, and you're still testing and questioning, and it's testing and questioning above and beyond the normal test and question. So absolutely, I got exhausted. But in the beginning of my career, I was so unaware of this type of like underground system that the people would say, what should we do? And I would say, I would raise my hand, we should do this. And that actually propelled me to the front of the room, not because I was right most of the time, even though I was right a lot of the time, more because I actually spoke up. And most of people, literally people wouldn't speak up. Then you get to the point where you are dangerous to people, right? When you're running groups where you can affect their lives, and then, you know, when the knives come out, right? Then you have to start to be a little bit smarter about how you maneuver. I had to be smart about how I maneuvered when I spoke. That is when it started to get really exhausting, right? Where you literally all the stuff that you have accolades for in the beginning. Look at her, she's willing to do. Now it becomes like she's a boss of people, and people are like, I don't know, she's getting, you know, too big for her britches. So we got to kind of figure out a way to contain her, and you know, and kind of keep her in line in check.
And the dynamic changed, and then you had to understand, as a leader, manager, you weren't just the engineer with the mathematical question. You had teams to run, you had knives out for you, you had people who, Katie.
Great. So our next question, what lessons did you take from your own mother once you became a parent?
Oh, just about I played my mother's book. Literally, I reran it almost word for word. The thing I couldn't do was mimic the poverty, because by the time I became but we tried. My husband and I tried to kind of inject the poverty, like you can't get a car, you know, all the crazy things that you do when you're a parent. My kids are flying on private jets, and then I tell them that they have to sit and coach when they get on the plane. And my daughter would walk on and say, why are all these people on my plane? I was there, sweetie, this is the commercial plane, sweetheart. It's not your plane. Well, that was a side joke, but it really did happen. My mother ruled with an iron hand. My mother had high expectations. She was unbelievably unforgiving for lack of effort. And my husband did the same thing with our children.
And both of, I mean, of course, Malcolm and Melissa are flawless.
Yeah.
We don't even want to talk about
flawless.
Malcolm and Melissa.
I say to people all the time when I introduce them, I said, here's my son, he's almost perfect. Here's my daughter, she's almost perfect. But only because they have turned out to be just really good kids. My son is a PhD from Stanford University. He got 3 degrees from MIT, dyslexic. Literally, my son could not read. And I just think about it, this Black boy in the schools of Rochester, he would have been literally thrown away. Fortunately, and this is what we do, there was an infrastructure around him that taught him how to deal with the disability that he had, the different ability that he had. Unbelievable kid, engaged to get married. We just don't know when. It was supposed to be last year, but they've kind of done their own, they're doing their own thing right now. But very well starting, he's in an energy and farming startup that he just started to bring cheap energy, affordable energy and better foods to island nations, which are generally Black and brown people live on these islands, and it's a long story. But he's a good kid, really good kid, great heart, and he's my stepson. So I did not give birth to my son. His mother, his natural mother, is still around, more than around. I mean, she's still, and this boy and I are so freaking close. It's amazing. It's like people, you know, he's in some ways closer than my daughter. Flip to my daughter. My daughter's name is Melissa. She is engaged. She married on August 1st.
In 3 weeks.
3 weeks, yeah. I'm not well prepared.
I know you're not. So
yeah, that's right. As you said right. I need help here. But anyway, I'm not well prepared. It's going to be in my apartment. This is her gift to her mother is to have a wedding that's more than 2 people. This was what she told me she was going to do. Go to City Hall. I said, well, you need witnesses. She said, the people who are behind us in line to get married are going to be whoever they are. Those are going to be her witnesses. She's going to come home and tell us that she's married, and that was it. I convinced her, because this has been COVID year. My husband died 2.5 years ago, that we need something to celebrate in the family. So I've now got the numbers up to 19 people who will be at the wedding, all in my apartment in New York City. She's a PhD student in English literature. She has an undergraduate degree in math and another degree in English. And then she got 2 graduate degrees in creative writing in English. Now she's getting a PhD. So I've trained good students. We just have to figure out whether they can make money, hoping that they can do that.
I don't think they need to make money. Hello.
By the way,
can we continue, please, Katie?
They don't need to.
Ursula, the next question. What advice would you give to BIPOC corporate executives given the current climate and last year's racial justice reckoning to continue to navigate and develop?
So of course it's perform, do all of this, learn the culture of your company, do all of the normal things. But then I say silence is not a good way to fully participate in the world. And you don't have to only speak about your P&L or your project. You have to speak about those things in the context of the world and in the context of full talent participation in the world, of proper use of technology in the world, about policing and the engagement of all of the people in the world. So I want BIPOC executives, BIPOC in general, to actually come to work and engage work as if it were a part of your life, because it is a part of your life. This is not this separate thing that has a separate set of rules that we kind of, when we walk in, everything changes. We have to participate in our industries, in our companies fully with ideas, not only and not always about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a separate topic, but as it is in life, which is a foundational element that we build on. So I keep saying to people, participate fully in work. I mean, participate with your whole self in work. People should know who you are, know what your thought processes are, and you should contribute from the perspective that you come from, not to try to kind of write it and fit it into a different lane. Your perspective, believe it or not, is more valuable today. People will pay money for your perspective today, when in the past they would have tried to shut you up. So we're in a very special time that we can actually change the way that we operate by being, just naturally fulsome, naturally knowledgeable about the world around you, which many people are not, because they haven't participated as fully as you have.
Katie, last question.
Last question. So as the US is opening up post-COVID, what is the one thing you are most looking forward to doing that you couldn't do during the pandemic?
Oh my God, hanging out with my friends freely. Nothing complicated here. Just, can I just go downstairs and we could go to a restaurant and just walk in and do it like spontaneously and just get back to that part of my life. So much of my life, I know this is true of you, Darren, as well. So much of your life, many of the people, is so organized now, right? It's so, everything is so programmed now. And then COVID made it even more insane, right? We've managed it down to the seconds. And I just look forward to the fact that I can have a kind of just an ordinary, totally disorganized day. Let's go here, let's go there, let's go to a restaurant and just walk in, sit, find out if they have a seat, and just sit down and eat. These are the kinds of things that I like. Going to a play, going to the movies. I mean, it's amazing. We just haven't done any of that. It's just been gone. But the interesting thing, and then we can close, we've gotten pretty used to this.
We haven't. I've not gotten used to this.
Darren, we are, not comfortable with it, but I go around, the world is operating. Moving, everybody's Zooming, we're doing this. People say to me, I closed a deal without meeting anybody. My son, I started working before he quit his job, but I started working, he's met nobody. People are like really proud of this. I'm like, no, people, this is not the way it's supposed to be. I want to go back. There's one thing I want to go back to, which is that we actually engage in 3D. I always say this, not in 2D. This 2D engagement is very, very tiring. And I think it drains your soul. So I'm just looking back to going back to real board meetings at the Ford Foundation where we walk into the building, right? Walk into the building, see the
October,
staff.
it's coming
Yeah.
soon.
Is that convenient? It's not as efficient. It's not as they say this. I'm like, I don't care. I don't care.
Human touch matters. We
does
know
matter.
from anthropological research that human interaction is essential. It's essential to community building, and it nourishes the soul.
Absolutely.
I think that there's no doubt that technology has made us more efficient, has made transactions. I love DocuSign. I know that through Zoom and Google Meets, we're able to process more transactions. But I don't think that we actually have the human interaction that we need to really be sustained. So I think we need to figure out what the right balance is going to be. But I am happy, like you, to have the last 18 months behind us.
Absolutely.
And I'm looking forward to the next. So with that, Ursula Maxine Burns, thank you for being with us today and for sharing your perspective, your highly praised book. Once again, if you have not gotten it, please order it. Amazon, any of the other Barnes and Noble, order the book. It's a great gift for friends. And Ideas at Ford will continue in September. We have Rob Reich and Jeremy Weinstein, the renowned Stanford professors on system era. That's September 13th. On September 28th, we have the Pulitzer Prize winning Professor Eric Foner on the second founding, the great book about the post-Civil War era. And then, of course, Professors Banerjee and Duflo from MIT, and they'll be with us in October. So Ideas and Ford will continue. Until then, thank you all for being with us.